Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Let's talk about the Birth of Tassadar by Sodon. I assume that's how you say Sodon's name. I didn't really know how to say very much of anything name-wise in this campaign. We had the Opie, which, bizarrely enough, when we were introduced to them by Zeratul, our resident fucking prophet, he gave us the pronunciation of it in parentheses. And yet he didn't do that for Aui, which is what I called it, because it's sort of like, you know, Hawaii or something. I don't know. It's spelled A-U-I-S, but a lot of the time, maybe it's like a French thing or something. I don't really remember where it came from. But a lot of the time you have like U-I-S, it's like we or E. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know why I decided to call it Aui, but it was very fitting, as my head did hurt quite a bit during this campaign. It's one of those campaigns, you know what it reminds me of is Reclamation of Ire, I think, where it starts out seemingly unassuming, or War of the Tribes even is a better example, actually. War of the Tribes, forget a Reclamation of Ire. War of the Tribes is the most insane story I think I've seen in a long time, because it starts out with like whatever, sure, there's some weird twist with Duran and stuff, and you got some penchant for drama and a little bit on the cringy side, but it's okay because you opened up with macro, even though it was flawed macro, it was still macro, and then you go into an absolutely insane shit show of a story where there's like a map that adds nothing to anything besides destroying the entirety of the game. And that was, of course, that cutscene map where like Raynor was, or Tassadar was like reborn, or somebody died. I don't really remember what happened, but I don't think I think it was actually that they went to the void and found Tassadar, which is basically StarCraft 2 at that point. So that's great. This one though, this is fan fiction. This is like full on fan fiction to try to like give Tassadar an origin story that nobody wanted him to have and nobody needed him to have in order to understand what his role in the story of StarCraft actually was. Maybe Blizzard did. Maybe Blizzard needed a fanfiction origin story for him that, rivaled the depths of insanity that Oros just being Tassadar the whole time actually ended up being. So, say what you will as to who had the worst story, Sodon or Blizzard, but bottom line is the origin for Tassadar in this one is that he's like the son of some real sick man. This Gwari guy runs into seas of piss lines of photon cannons and just annihilates himself 24/7. I don't know what's up with that guy. But I think the most peculiar thing about the Birth of Tassadar is actually how little I have to say at the end of the day. It's one of those campaigns, I guess it's kind of like a Reclamation, or no, that's not the right campaign, is it? Resurgence? Yeah, it's like Varanus' campaigns. Liberation, maybe. You finish it and you're like, and? That was it? Like, there's some insanity in here. There's a lot of mineral fields that were completely inaccessible. There's a lot of photon cannons and a comparable number of missile turrets, I guess. And, there's a lot of stuff. But, like, nothing was so much of a travesty from the gameplay side of things, besides maybe that weird micro mission where we had to kill Cerebrit, and it was, like, horribly paced, and there's just infested Terrans lying around, lying in wait, waiting, biding their time. Necron is always there to stab you in the back. Constantly check your corners. Don't let your guard down. He could be anywhere. He could be borrowed in every corner of the map. And, yeah, I know, Necron, corner of a map. I'm not talking about Torn here. But seriously, though, the Birth of Tassadar is one of those strange projects where you come out of it feeling very bewildered, but you can't quite place why you feel so bewildered. It could be that the story is just so bad, and yet it took such a focus without being consistent whatsoever. It's completely schizophrenic in terms of the way that it was presented, where you had like Zeratul giving you a bunch of exposition, and then, basically serving as this weird like Greek chorus almost, except it definitely wasn't thought of, in that way. I'm just assuming, like, reverse engineering and guessing here from the quality and caliber of project that I played. I assume Sodon wasn't thinking, oh yes, this is why I'm doing this. I assume he didn't even know what the fuck a Greek chorus was. But maybe I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say, sure, whatever. Maybe part of that was intentional. Yet it still doesn't actually add anything. Like, the execution is totally off, if that indeed was the intention. And conceptually, there's really nothing to talk about with the Birth of Tassadar. There's nothing interesting. There's nothing that's even controversial. It's just average, below average, very mediocre. Execution flounders. It's not as colossal a failure of a campaign as some of the other stuff that I've played, for sure. It's not really consistently mediocre either, though, because there are many times where it is actually a colossal failure. Like, for example, the Terran mission, where you just have unit unplaceable everywhere. Like, you obviously didn't even fucking test your map, dude. And that's a point where, like, I don't even understand how that can exist in the same space as somebody who's trying to tell a real epic story about their fan fiction about, you know, which anus Tassadar came out of, which is just so insane. Like, I don't know why he made Protoss have, you know, birth and stuff. That I don't know. I don't know. It felt like he was trying to make them too relatable. You know what I mean? Maybe he didn't realize that there was no confirmed lore about how Protoss reproduce. But I have to feel that you probably know that. You know, I feel like there was something about that in the manual, but I haven't looked at the manual in a while. Either way, maybe you're just trying to say, hey, my version of StarCraft has Protoss reproduce that way, where they give birth like humans. Well, okay, but you kind of have to establish that with more than just like a throwaway sentence, you know what I mean? With more than just stating that I have a pregnant wife and she's a Nerazim, by the way, and then she's dead. I don't know, man. I guess one element of floundering incompetence was definitely the way that the story twists happened and how basically nothing was set up. That was probably one of the biggest factors in keeping you bewildered as a member of the audience watching the playthrough. And as a player myself, I can speak to this, where you don't really understand what the characters' motivations are or what these characters even are in the beginning or in the end. You don't really get a feel for who they are as characters. They don't really feel like characters. They feel more like plot devices with dialogue. And that's really bad, obviously. You want your characters to feel consistent. But I generally refrain from talking about story and custom content just because I know that most of what I say is not going to really help people, right? Because all I can do is like, you know, to me, the Birth of Tassadar is not really surprising in terms of how bad its story was. It's more about the execution to me. It's more that the execution flounders and fails. The reason why I say that, the reason why I make note of that, is because what I actually want, if I'm going to critique a story, is to try to explain, you know, how it could be improved and what could have been changed. And in this case, in order to make a significant improvement with the story, you would actually have to rewrite most of it, right? And that's how I feel about a lot of the content that I play. So that's generally why I avoid talking about the story of a campaign, at least in the review, because to me that doesn't even matter really as much as the gameplay anyways. But on top of that, it's really hard to give people critique that is tantamount to start over from scratch and just redo it. You know what I mean? It's not very useful for anybody, even if they aren't the developer of that project. They come in, they think, oh, I wonder what so-and-so Pronogo thinks about a story. I wonder, you know, what I can learn if I'm trying to write my own story or think about stories in a different way, even if I'm not trying to write them, if I want to critique them myself. Like, you can't really pull anything away from the Birth of Tassadar in terms of learning about how not to write stories, because it's such a bad example of a story in an interactive medium that it just fails to even be useful for an educational purpose. It's not even like a guide on how not to do it, because it's just so ass backwards. It's so underdeveloped. There's nothing really feeding into itself. I guess the one thing you can learn from it is the importance of setting stuff up beforehand and having the famous George Lucas quote where he says, like, you know, stuff rhymes after a while. You gotta make the story rhyme with itself. That is actually really good advice, sage advice from Mr. Lucas, even though he turned out to be a complete bumbling lunatic later on. The point is, you want stuff to happen that feels like it should happen in your universe, that it could happen in your universe, and even if it's a twist, people can still reverse engineer the reason it happened, the cause of it, and understand that it makes sense, you know? And that sounds like very basic shit. Literally, I'm saying your story and the events in your story need to make sense. But name me one custom campaign where that happens. Name me one custom campaign I've done a playthrough of at all in recent history, but I would say just ever in my career as an angry man on the internet. Name me one campaign that had a sensible, you know, cause and effect chain for this happens and this is why, and this means that happens, and in addition to this, that's also why. Like, there's nothing. There's no set of characters, there's no set of story events, there's no plot that is internally or externally consistent. Nothing that makes sense within the confines of StarCraft, beyond its premise, perhaps. Certainly not in its execution. And there's really nothing that even is internally consistent where, like, okay, well, pretend regular StarCraft didn't happen, or pretend it's, like, just say, okay, it's fine if you're operating by completely different rules. What about what your story is by itself. Like, how is it internally consistent? How internally consistent is it? Is a better way to phrase that. And you don't get an answer. You just get somebody clicking off, hanging up on the phone, just completely fucking destroying you because they can't answer that question. So they opt to annihilate you. I don't know, man. I think that the story of Birth of Tassadar is not really, again, it's not that new, it's not that novel. The point of it, of looking at it, is not to glean useful information from it. All you can really understand is that it was a colossal failure in that respect. But when it comes to gameplay, like as a campaign, as a piece of interactive software, it wasn't such a colossal failure, barring like the training mission and the Cerebrit mission. Those particular failures didn't have so much, I guess, internal calamities, like outside of those particular things, that the entire experience fell apart. It was just like really mediocre, and I certainly would have checked out immediately after the first mission, let alone the second one or any of the subsequent ones, had I not been streaming. If the record or stream button isn't pushed, I often say I probably wouldn't complete half the stuff, more than half the stuff that I actually play. But I do so just for posterity's sake, partially because I want to immortalize StarCraft custom content in somewhere. The annals of YouTube may be the only place that exists, but at least people can take a look at what's out there and what was made. And, that means you take the good with the bad, and most of it is bad. Birth of Tassadar was bad. I would not recommend it to anybody. I think really you don't need anything. You can't learn anything from its failures, and its successes, if they exist at all, are so minor and so infrequent that it doesn't really justify the playthrough. But at the very least, I hope you guys had some laughs. Really, there's nothing to say about the gameplay itself. It was very bland. It was very, very much everything you've seen before. And I guess that's to be expected from a campaign that came out in the year 2000. But I really think that the story is actually one of the more interesting elements to take away from it, even though you can't learn anything from it, just as a spectacle. Like how fucked up it was and how bizarre it was. It was very strange. And maybe that is something that you can learn from. You want to get your campaign talked about, at least have an insane story that's absolutely bonkers, fan fiction all over the place, make Mark proud, hashtag, I don't know, me too, I guess. I've been raped.